The crisp morning air cut through the busy city street, the kind of chill that hinted at the changing seasons. Crowds bustled along the sidewalks, moving quickly as they prepared to face another day. The sounds of hurried footsteps, cars honking, and snippets of conversations filled the air, creating a vibrant, energetic atmosphere. In the midst of the city's morning rush, a black woman walked down the sidewalk, her movements graceful yet purposeful. She was dressed sharply, her suit tailored to perfection, exuding confidence and professionalism. In her hand, she carried a coffee cup, taking a sip between strides, seemingly unaffected by the chaos of the busy street. The woman's presence contrasted the hustle around her. She moved with a quiet self-assurance, a woman who had worked hard to be where she was. Little did the people around her know she was not just another business professional. She was the new chief of the FBI, a position that placed her at the forefront of law enforcement in the country. But today, no one would recognize her title. They would only see the confident woman walking down the street, carrying her coffee as if it were just any other morning. A white police officer patrolling the area noticed her as she walked by. His gaze followed her, sharp and calculating. He had seen people like her before, he thought. His assumptions, clouded by years of ingrained prejudice, led him to believe that she didn't belong in the area. In his eyes, she wasn't the type to be walking these streets. He was known for his discriminatory attitude, and it didn't take long for him to start sizing her up, making judgments about her based on nothing but the color of her skin and his own biased perceptions. The officer's instincts kicked in, and he followed her, maintaining a distance that allowed him to observe her movements. His eyes lingered on her, focused and judgmental, as though waiting for her to slip up. He assumed that someone like her, a black woman walking confidently in this neighborhood, wasn't supposed to be there. Perhaps she was lost. Perhaps she was up to something. His mind raced with assumptions, all of them tainted by years of bias. He didn't think about the woman's accomplishments or her position. He only saw the color of her skin and felt the need to monitor her every move. The tension in the air was palpable as the officer continued to trail her from a distance, waiting for an excuse, an opportunity to make a move. His steps matched hers, though she remained unaware of the attention she was drawing. The crowd around her seemed oblivious to the interaction unfolding just a few feet away, as if the world continued on while this officer built up the moment in his mind. He was ready to act. In his mind, this woman didn't belong here, and he was preparing himself for whatever he thought was about to unfold. The woman walking down the bustling city street was calm, composed, and utterly unaware of the tension brewing in the mind of the officer trailing her. To the passers-by, she was just another professional, moving through her day with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. What they didn't know was that beneath the polished exterior, this woman was the newly appointed FBI chief, an unparalleled achievement that represented the culmination of years of hard work, perseverance, and a fierce dedication to justice. She had spent her entire career fighting to break through barriers, working her way up through the ranks of law enforcement, despite facing countless obstacles and overt discrimination. From a young age, she had known the sting of prejudice, feeling it first as a child and later as a young officer, when her abilities were often questioned by those who couldn't accept the idea of a woman of color rising through the ranks of such a male-dominated field. Despite these challenges, she had risen to the top, earning her promotion to the role of FBI chief. Her background in law enforcement was solid, her resume filled with years of hard-fought victories in the pursuit of justice. She had spent countless hours investigating crimes advocating for reform, and leading initiatives that sought to address the systemic issues within the justice system. She had always believed in the power of law to create fairness and equality, and, as FBI chief, she knew her role was now more important than ever. Her work had always focused on combating the biases that were prevalent in the justice system, biases that led to injustice for people of color. She had worked tirelessly to promote racial equity within the police force and within the broader justice system. Yet despite her accomplishments and her tireless efforts to create positive change, she knew that her job had only just begun. Every day, she was faced with the challenge of fighting against the very biases she had spent her career trying to eradicate. Even in her new role, as one of the highest-ranking figures in American law enforcement, she had to prove herself again and again. Her position as FBI chief was a testament to her unwavering dedication to the law, but it was also a reminder of the deep-rooted prejudice she still faced. She had proven, time and time again, that her competence was beyond question. Still, the system she fought to reform remained resistant to change. It was this system that the officer, trailing her on the street, had come to represent. The officer, a seasoned member of the police force, was no stranger to racial prejudice. He had been on the force for years, carrying with him a biased worldview shaped by his experiences and his inflated sense of authority. He had a history of judging others based on the color of their skin, not their actions. His interactions with people of color were often tainted by his assumptions, and his use of power was frequently out of line with the duties of his role. He had often belittled those he deemed out of place or undeserving, especially when it came to people of color. His position as an officer gave him a sense of superiority, one he believed justified his disrespectful behavior. The officer had never been held accountable for his actions. His peers and superiors had looked the other way, reinforcing his belief that his biases were somehow acceptable. As far as he was concerned, the system had always supported him, and he felt emboldened to act on his prejudices without fear of repercussions. As he followed the woman down the street, his judgment was clouded by years of biased thinking, ready to act on the assumptions he had formed. Little did he know, the woman he was following was not just another professional walking down the street. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her journey was far from over. The morning was still alive with activity, and the woman moved through the city street, holding her coffee as she continued her walk. The crisp air brushed against her face, and the city's familiar sounds were a soothing background to her thoughts. She had dealt with worse before, countless meetings, press conferences, and bureaucratic hurdles. But today, as she sipped her coffee and walked with purpose, she never expected the confrontation that was about to unfold. The officer, watching from a distance, had been following her for some time. His mind churned with assumptions, each more prejudiced than the last. He saw a black woman walking through a neighborhood he believed was beyond her reach. In his biased mind, she didn't belong here, at least not without suspicion. Without reason or provocation, he decided to take action. He approached her quickly, blocking her path, his presence suddenly looming over her. "Stop right there," he ordered, his voice rough and demanding. The woman paused, surprised, but her expression remained calm. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew it wasn't good. The officer's eyes were filled with a judgmental look, and there was something in his posture that immediately felt wrong. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice laced with unwarranted hostility. "You're acting suspicious. What's your business in this neighborhood?" She raised an eyebrow at him, confused. I'm just walking to my office, she said, her voice even and composed. She had faced prejudice before, and had learned how to stay calm in moments like this, but the officer wasn't listening. I don't think you belong here, he sneered, taking another step closer. His eyes were now narrowing, filled with an arrogant certainty. Then, in an unexpected and impulsive move, the officer grabbed his coffee cup, which he had been carrying, and splashed it directly onto the woman's blouse. The hot liquid splattered against her professional attire, as the officer grinned as if he had just done something righteous. You need to learn your place, he muttered under his breath, his sense of superiority clear. The woman stood frozen for a moment, her mind processing the absurdity of what had just happened. She was stunned, but she didn't react with the anger that bubbled up inside her. Instead, she took a deep breath, her body remaining steady, despite the chaos of the moment. She could feel the crowd around them starting to notice, some beginning to pull out their phones, others shifting uncomfortably. In the middle of the humiliation and the officer's arrogance, she finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. You have no idea who I am, she said, her words cutting through the tension. With unshaken composure, she slowly reached for her ID, pulling out her official badge. I'm the new FBI chief, she declared, her voice steady but heavy with authority. The officer's smirk faltered, and he took a step back. His eyes widened as the realization of who she truly was hit him. This wasn't just any woman walking down the street. This was the highest-ranking official in law enforcement, and he had just assaulted her without any justification. As the crowd murmured in disbelief, some began speaking out against the officer's behavior. The tension between the two grew, but it was clear now that the power dynamics had shifted. Have you ever encountered a moment where assumptions were made about you based on your appearance? Where are you watching from, and what time is it on your side of the world? The moment the words left her lips, the entire atmosphere seemed to shift. The officer's arrogance faltered, and for the first time in their brief encounter, he seemed to lose control. His smug expression quickly turned to one of shock, and a nervous energy overtook him. His hand, still gripped tightly around his radio, suddenly felt heavy, and his breath became shallow. What? He stammered, his words failing him. The woman stood tall, not saying another word, but her presence alone conveyed everything that needed to be said. The officer's hand started to shake as he reached for his belt, fumbling with his radio as though he wanted to call for backup. But his mind wasn't on the procedure. It was on the undeniable truth that had just been spoken. This wasn't just a random woman. This was the FBI chief. He had just assaulted one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. He stood frozen, staring at the badge she had just shown him, as if trying to reconcile the reality of what had just happened. The woman had calmly revealed her identity, and in that instant, the officer realized the enormity of his mistake. His mind raced, and the shame flooded in. How had he let his bias cloud his judgment so completely? How had he made such an unthinkable error? As the crowd around them began to murmur, more people pulled out their phones, the lens of a camera pointing in his direction. The officer's face paled. His heart raced as the reality sank in. There was no way to undo what he had just done. No way to take back the humiliation he had caused her. No way to erase the growing buzz on social media. The world had seen him for what he truly was. A man driven by prejudice. A man who used his position to assert his power inappropriately. The woman, unmoved by his stammering apology that never came, began to walk away slowly. She had nothing more to say to him. Her actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. But it wasn't over. The officer wasn't free of the consequences of his actions just yet. The crowd began to swell, and it wasn't long before the first video appeared on social media, capturing the moment the coffee was thrown and the powerful revelation that followed. Tweets started to flood in, and hashtags like #justice for her and #racist officer began trending. By the time the officer realized the gravity of the situation, it was too late. His actions had already been broadcasted to millions, and there was no going back. The spotlight had shifted, and now he was the one in the hot seat. In the minutes following the incident, the officer stood frozen, realizing the fear in the pit of his stomach was nothing compared to the firestorm that was building around him. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were all at risk. And as the woman disappeared from view, the only thing the officer could think about was the damage he had just done, not just to her, but to himself. The moment the officer's badge was revealed and the damage was done, the woman stood still, calm and unwavering, as though nothing in the world could shake her resolve. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about addressing the broader issues of racial bias, discrimination, and the systemic failures that had been allowed to persist for too long. As the officer stood frozen, the woman remained composed. She calmly reached for her phone and made a call to the appropriate authorities. "I'd like to file an official complaint," she began, her voice steady and professional. "I want an immediate investigation into the officer's conduct." Her words were clear and precise, making it clear that this was not going to be swept under the rug. Within hours, the officer was suspended and placed under internal review. The department had no choice but to respond swiftly, given the gravity of the situation. The woman's words and actions had put the spotlight on the officer's misconduct, but she made it clear that this incident was not just about his behavior. It was about the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. The news of the officer's suspension spread quickly, but so did the larger conversation sparked by the incident. People from all walks of life began to discuss the deep-rooted issues of racial bias within law enforcement. The woman, who had always been a champion for justice, seized the opportunity to push for meaningful change. She advocated for mandatory diversity and bias training across all law enforcement agencies, calling for more accountability at every level of policing. "This isn't just an isolated incident," she said in a public statement. "This is part of a larger systemic problem that we need to address head-on. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked." As the newly appointed FBI chief, the woman wasted no time in implementing her vision for reform. She launched initiatives focused on community outreach, emphasizing the importance of building trust and fostering transparency between law enforcement and the public. She initiated new policies that would hold officers accountable for their actions, ensuring that every individual, regardless of race or background, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Empowerment, she believed, was the key to change. In the days following the incident, the woman used her platform to inspire those around her. She spoke to officers across the country, encouraging them to reflect on their actions and how they could contribute to building a more inclusive and equitable justice system. Her leadership, characterized by integrity and fairness, set the tone for the future of law enforcement in the country. The incident that had begun with a senseless act of racial bias had now become a catalyst for transformation. The woman's leadership, strength, and unwavering commitment to justice were now a beacon for others to follow. And in that moment, she knew that her mission wasn't just about fixing the system, it was about changing the way the system operated, from the ground up. The woman had shown the world that true leadership wasn't about authority. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. And now, with the FBI under her guidance, a new era of fairness and accountability was beginning to take shape. Under the woman's steady hand, the FBI, along with other law enforcement agencies, began to experience real change. The incident with the officer, initially a moment of deep racial injustice, had sparked a wave of reform that no one could ignore. Across the nation, law enforcement agencies were now looking at the woman's leadership as a model for the future. Her reforms began to take shape quickly. New policies were introduced that mandated bias training for officers at every level, from recruits to seasoned veterans. The training wasn't just about theory. It was about practical, real-world tools to help law enforcement personnel recognize their biases and learn how to actively counteract them in the field. Officers were now being held to higher standards, and any hint of discriminatory behavior was met with swift action. It wasn't enough to simply talk about equality. It had to be lived every day, on every street, in every interaction. The woman didn't stop there. She made sure that the agency's leadership reflected the diversity of the nation it served. Under her watch, more women and people of color were appointed to leadership positions within the FBI. The policies surrounding racial bias were not only revised but completely restructured, putting community safety and respect for all citizens at the forefront of law enforcement priorities. The changes were not immediate, nor were they without their critics, but they were undeniable. The woman had proven that true leadership isn't about making promises. It's about making real, lasting change. And as the public began to see the results, her influence only grew. In the final scene, the woman stands alone in her office, looking out over the city she has sworn to protect. It's a moment of quiet reflection, a rare stillness amidst the whirlwind of her responsibilities. The city below her is full of people, each with their own story, each with their own struggle. And as she watches the streets pulse with life, she realizes how far the journey has come, from that single, unjust encounter to a sweeping, transformative wave that was changing the course of law enforcement for good. Her gaze shifts from the bustling world outside to the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her younger self, determined yet unaware of the challenges ahead. In that moment, she understands the full weight of her work. Her personal battle for fairness had evolved into a nationwide effort for equality and justice. One woman's resilience had become the spark for a much-needed transformation, proving that leadership, when coupled with integrity, can move mountains. Her hand rests on the desk, steady, as she whispers a line to herself, one that would resonate far beyond her office. True leadership doesn't let injustice slide. It confronts it head-on and leads by example. With that, she turns away from the window, ready for the next challenge. The work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful for the future.